My name is Ilse Treurnecht, and it really is a great pleasure to give you a warm welcome to Mars and to this Mars Global Leadership event. Today's event is part of a series that allows us to bring into our community people who are thinkers and doers on the global stage and who come and share their experiences with us on topics that matter. And today's event is a very special one because it's part of our special partnership with Social Innovation Generation, or SIG, and their Inspiring Action for Social Impact series. So thank you very much to Tim Drayman and his team for making this happen, and they deserve a round of applause. I'd also like to extend a very warm thank you to the Metcalf Foundation, to the School for Public Policy and Governance at the University of Toronto, and the Center for Social Innovation for their generous support of today's event. Thank you very much. Today's event is also truly a national conversation. In addition to this wonderfully diverse audience here in Toronto, we are being joined via live stream by audiences in Halifax, St. John, Montreal, Waterloo, Ottawa, Calgary, Edmonton, Vancouver, and Victoria. Welcome to all of you. This is clearly an indication both of the deserved reputation of our keynote speaker, but I think it also speaks to the deep desire of Canadians for some new thinking in these challenging times. It certainly is rare for us here at Mars to have the opportunity to have someone whose work is so closely aligned with our own mission. Geoff Mulgan is the Chief Executive of Nesta in the UK, and Nesta is the country's foremost independent expert on how innovation can tackle the tough economic and social challenges of that country. He's done many interesting things in his past life, and among those, he was the founder and director of a think tank, Demos. He became the first chief executive of the Young Foundation, who many of you know as a leading center for social innovation in the UK. Geoff understands how government works. He held various roles in the UK government, including director of the government strategy unit, head of policy in the Prime Minister's office, and he was the chief advisor to Gordon Brown. In his spare time, he's a visiting professor at the London School of Economics, University College London, and at Melbourne University, and has advised governments around the world. He's also a prolific author, and his journalistic roots are reflected in the fantastic titles of his books, so I encourage you to check those out, but one that's close to our heart is one called Social Innovation: What It Is, Why It Matters, and How It Can Be Accelerated. Today, Geoff is going to talk about the very timely topic of austerity and innovation. We all know that doing more of the same or doing more with less is just not going to get us positioned for the future, particularly not post the global economic crisis and the escalating social, economic, and environmental challenges we face. The imperative for innovation is stronger than ever. At the same time, governments here and elsewhere are more and more focused on austerity. So Geoff has had a unique window seat on this debate in the United Kingdom. But more importantly, he is a true change agent who has worked very hard and very hands-on to tackle this very complex challenge directly, both through Nesta and through his own personal leadership. As Geoff concludes his remarks today, we will welcome Tony Dean to the stage to respond to the presentation and to facilitate a Q&A with our audience here and elsewhere. Tony is a professor at the School of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Toronto, but from 2002 to 2008, he was Secretary of the Cabinet and head of the Ontario Public Service, so I'd say he's rather well qualified for this task. So let's go on to the main event, and it's my great pleasure, and please join me in giving a warm welcome to Geoff Mulgan. Geoff?
Well, thanks very much for that welcome, and thank you all for being here and across Canada. It's an amazingly glittering audience we have here, and I hope I can share something useful with you. It seems odd to be talking about austerity on a full stomach. We probably should have had this session before lunch, but anyway, here goes. And I should say I've been a great admirer of Mars since about 3 years ago. I think Ilse and John Evans, who is here, showed me all that was going on here, and one of my hopes for the next few years is we can recreate some of the elements of Mars in London. And SIG has been a great exemplar of catalyzing understanding, energy, enthusiasm in social innovation. What I'm going to talk about is sort of these two ideas. How does austerity affect innovation? Is innovation the luxury you have in the boom years and then you have to sort of ditch it when times get hard? Or does it actually become more important when you're having to make big savings, change your way of life? And I've been seeing this debate unfold not just in the UK, which has severe public spending cuts have already happened, but in fact the worst cuts will happen this year and next. The situation will be much starker by 2014 than it is now. And also with various other governments around the world, including the unfortunate experience of working as an advisor to George Papandreou in Greece, who certainly got the austerity but didn't have any time to do the innovation bit. What I thought I'd start with is a couple of examples, really inspired by this painting. Do any of you know this painting? Which I think is the best painting about innovation that I know, which shows the steamboat pulling the old, beautiful sailing boat to be smashed to pieces as progress happened in England in the 1840s and 50s. And what this is good about, in a way, is it's a reminder innovation is often quite a painful process. It involves giving up things which are quite beautiful, things we're used to, things we love, in order to make way for something which may be better and may start off a bit uglier, like this little steamboat. Here is a first example of innovation and austerity. I don't know how many of you know this one, the Akash computer, made by a British firm in India. It went on market for, I think, $60 initially, and is one of the symbols of what's happening in fascinating ways in India and other parts of the world, of the movement of frugal innovation, trying to find much cheaper methods of doing innovation, but also cheaper products and services, trying to almost reverse the tendency of the late 20th century when R&D became ever more expensive, ever more complicated, and produced ever more elaborate and expensive products. And we're learning a lot from countries like India about how to do innovation differently. Here's another example. Some of you may have used couch surfing. How many people in this room have been couch surfers? A handful. I mean, couch surfing now has more beds on it than all the international hotel chains put together. And essentially, you can offer your bed for a traveller to come and stay in Vancouver or Halifax or Toronto, and amazingly, you get a reasonably nice human being turns up. And it's a dramatically cheaper way of organising travel and tourism. And there's a whole family of innovations of this kind using the web to provide services in much simpler, much cheaper ways than the Hilton or whoever else. And one of the questions for me is, what's the public sector equivalence of the Akash and couch surfing? How do we get these leaner, smarter, often simpler innovations into our systems? Now, a word about where I come from, Nesta. Nesta was set up as an endowment funded by the lottery in the UK. And what we do now fits into sort of 2 or 3 categories, and I'll just go through it very briefly so you've got a sense. We're quite like Mars in some respects, in that we do quite a lot of commercial investment in early stage technology companies, acting like a venture capital fund. We fund accelerators, incubators, and increasingly funding impact investment on the boundaries of social space and the commercial. We also do a lot of policy and research. And I'll just focus perhaps on this one book which came out a few weeks ago, which is called The Art of Exit, which is not about suicide, but is about how in conditions of austerity can you decommission services in ways which are creative and generate added value. And it's a series of case studies of good examples from the public sector around the world of seriously changing whole systems, shutting down some services, but ending up with greater value for the public. And we published it partly to encourage public service leaders to see austerity and cuts not just as a terrible constraint, something to be fatalistic about, that it could, with good leadership, be turned into a force for positive change. Not easy, but it is possible. And I'd urge you to read it. It's a very well-written report, apart from anything else. We also run programs, and just last week launched a Centre for Challenge Prizes, which is issuing monetary challenges to innovators who can come up with good ideas on everything from carbon measurement to bicycling. And we hope increasingly we'll be using this sort of challenge method for innovation for austerity, setting targets for service provision against lower costs and with a monetary reward for people who can come up with innovative designs. Just as couch surfing offers a hotel bed at a dramatically lower cost than the Hilton, can we find equivalent ways of mobilizing creativity for public services? And we're doing a lot of work around innovation skills. How do you train up people in the public sector, in charities, in business, to do particularly social innovation more effectively? And I can talk a bit more about that. We will be providing a lot of these tools online, free for use, and I hope we will have both plenty of Canadian case studies there, but also use of this. Now, this is a chart which is in some ways obvious to any economist, but still completely alien to most public services. And all this chart shows, and this comes from Nesta Economic Analysis of the UK, but the figures will be the same in Canada, is if you look at the economy, a large proportion of any advance in productivity, any advance in growth comes from innovation. Most economists would reckon it at 70 to 80% of any economic growth comes from innovation in new ways of doing banking or retailing or manufacturing. Almost everything in this room is the effect of some innovation in lighting or computers or even furniture manufacture. We have almost no equivalent discussion in the public sector. We have almost no equivalent data for the public sector, but it's almost certain that any serious productivity gain in healthcare or welfare education will come from innovation and from investment in innovation and from all of those other things. And in the private sector, we've tried breaking down what that actually means, and we've developed these indices for private sector investment in R&D and design and software and so on, which show typically in the private sector about 14% of output equivalent is spent on investment in innovation, and of that only a very small proportion is classic R&D of the kind that governments have in R&D funds. And it seems to me likely that in the public sector and in civil society, probably roughly the same is the case, that you should be spending 10-15% of turnover on innovation if you're to remain dynamic, remain lively, remain achieving productivity improvements. You show me the public agency which spends anything like that, or the public agency which even has a clue how much it spends on any of these things, and I'd be fascinated to see what it does. We've got an enormous gap between how we think about innovation in the economy and how we think about it and do it in the public sector and the rest of society. And one of the effects of that is this chart, which I showed at an event on aging here earlier in the week, which shows health spend across the OECD countries and mortality rates. And it shows that the more you spend, the more people die. This one shows the more you increase the amount you spend, the worse you do in keeping people alive. Now, these are dramatic symptoms of large systems which are completely failing on productivity, which do not have innovation built into how they work, where what spending they do have on innovation, particularly in the pharma industry, isn't delivering results, and so on. And I could show equivalents for many other fields like education or welfare. These are why, even if we didn't have fiscal crises, we would need to be completely overhauling our innovation systems. What I want to do briefly now is share really a sort of framework which we developed as the crisis became apparent in the UK to help mainly public sector organisations think through how they could cope with 20, 30, 40% cuts and come out the other end with better services, or at least not dramatically worse services. And it's just a framework which I hope is useful, but it's mainly a prompt for managers, frontline workers to, in a sense, get involved in innovation. So the first things I would mention are methods of cutting which everyone will be familiar with and which are standard for any organisation. You stop doing things. You sell off your assets. Or you trim. You freeze pay. You focus your service in on the essentials. You get rid of, I don't know, expense accounts or weekend opening. Or you delay things. You delay capital programs, recruitment, pay rises. Every public service across Europe is doing all these things now. Everyone in Canada, I'm sure at various points, has had to do all of these things. It's part of how you learn coping with austerity. But much more interesting than these are the ways you can think of responding to pressure in more creative ways. And here we come to a different set of economies which in a way involve organisational innovation. You look for potential economies of scale. Can you be doing things at a bigger scale? Can you be aggregating functions? Couch surfing is a brilliant example of reaping economies of scale of a web platform which can be scaled to millions of beds at almost no marginal cost. There's economies of scope. Can you bring together different functions to save money? One-stop shop. In our case, we had personal advisors visiting people for the pension service, and they started providing services to other public agencies which needed to talk to those older people in their home. And there's been some very interesting experiments on aggregating capital planning and building planning across different bits of government. Then slightly more unusual for governments is looking at economies of flow. When you analyse how an individual moves through a set of services as a patient, as a student, as a welfare claimant, it soon becomes apparent there are lots of unnecessary costs and bottlenecks and duplications and handovers. And a great deal has been done, some of it using technology, but often just using sort of smart thinking to innovate to reap economies of flow. And not to think in terms of bureaucratic silos and service delivery, but the experience. We've looked, in cities at least, at ways of aggregating in by place, by street or housing block. Are there ways of reorganising services to save money? And the final one, which is perhaps the most interesting, is looking at what we've called circuit economies. Are there places where public spending is essentially going to pick up the costs of failure in another bit of the public sector? You get this for call centres. You can analyse what percentage of phone calls are the result of a failure to deal with the issue, the complaint, the first time round. In hospitals, we have a very high problem of failure demand, people discharged from hospital who are back within a few weeks or a few months, sometimes unavoidably, but sometimes avoidably. We have in the prison system in the UK still 2/3 of prisoners back within 2 years. A dramatic failure of circuit economies not being reaped. And we've been trying to develop these financing tools like social impact bonds, but also analytical tools, planning tools, to see where we can achieve savings and re-engineer the whole system so you get it right first time. So children leave school adequately qualified for work. prisoners leave the prison with a home, with a job, with an advisor to stop them getting back into crime. Discharge from hospital is discharge into a circle of support who will help the person stay healthy. Then we've got a set of economies which are relational. And this is where social innovation becomes perhaps most important. We've got a big set of issues around the boundaries of the state and the citizen. Are there areas where more responsibility could be passed out to citizens? Not just perhaps paying more for services, but self-testing, self-managing. We're running programs in 6 areas of England around co-production in healthcare. Can you get patients much more involved in the design and management of their own care and supporting each other for diabetes or MS or mental illnesses? And usually you can save money by doing that and increase their own experience, improve it. Community asset transfers. Can you pass some assets like parks out to community groups to run, and they often end up doing it in very innovative ways, integrating food production, music, the arts, etc., into running a park in a way that the municipal agency didn't do. Often very controversial. This is where, a lot of politics around responsibility. We've had great experience of visibility, economies of visibility. When our MPs' expenses were made visible, they went down, amazingly. Our current government has made all public contracts over £25,000 available on the web, and that creates a downward pressure on spending. But there's also, I think, a really interesting aspect of this, which heart surgery actually embodies, where our chief medical officer about 5 years ago got all the heart surgeons to publish their survival rates, and found an enormous variation on survival rates amongst the 480 or so surgeons, and simply doing that forced the poor performers to raise their game, to learn from the good ones, and there's been a roughly, he says, 50% improvement in survival rates solely by making things visible and transparent. And I still think we're only just beginning the revolution of making public data visible and transparent and open to the public to analyse, mash, mine, use, etc. We've got economies of regulation and risk. Often in boom times you get very over-elaborate compliance regimes and so on, which you have to change. And finally, economies of commitment. Can you shift provision to more committed people? And a little example of this came up with a conversation this morning in the provincial government. Rural transport services. We had lots of rural buses being cut because they weren't economic, but if you instead got them run by a social enterprise which could sometimes use volunteer drivers who were really committed to keeping the town or village in touch, they became economic. Not very complicated, but it was a different way of thinking about economics than you'd ever get, let's say, from a management consultancy. It wouldn't occur to them to tap into commitment. So those were a set of ways of thinking about austerity and savings, all of which, in a way, force thinking about innovation, often across organisational boundaries, and often involve some rethinking of the boundaries of what the state does, what the citizen does. Now, I'm going to go very quickly through some thoughts about what this all means for the processes of innovation. We've done a lot of work looking at the different process models, whether they are linear or non-linear, and how you can adapt them. And there isn't time to go through all of this. But in a way, in countries like the UK, because of austerity, we're trying to think about innovation processes in the light of the need not just to improve services, but to achieve efficiencies and gains in value for money. And we've, over the last few years, developed this sort of process model of trying to look at methods and tools and skills at each stage of the innovation process, drawing on case studies from around the world. And if you're interested, the Open Book of Social Innovation, which is in the middle, was our first attempt at gathering about 600 methods from around the world, and we've been accumulating many others ever since. And so at the prompt stage, I think we're more and more looking at things like cost escalation, failure demand as the prompts for driving innovation. And that's perhaps sort of obvious and unavoidable. We're then looking at how can you generate ideas which are missing perhaps from the existing hierarchies, bureaucracies, and so on. I still believe Linus Pauling's comment, he's the only man ever to win 2 Nobel Prizes, is true, unavoidably. The only way to get good ideas is to have lots of ideas and throw the bad ones away. But therefore you need mechanisms which drive the generation of lots of ideas. And the 12 economies approach was primarily used to help public servants and others generate lots and lots of ideas. So you'd set a team of nurses or police officers the task of coming up with ideas under each of those headings. You then may throw 19 out of 20 away, but you're likely to have a new insight, a new possibility you didn't have otherwise. And as I said earlier, we're looking at things like competitions and prizes, as well as design tools and so on to generate more ideas. Then we need to prototype, test, and pilot them. Much more use of formal prototyping. Nesta's provided a lot of tools to help, again, public servants or social organizations or businesses move faster to a prototype which can be tested quickly, maybe in weeks or months rather than in years. And a lot of use of formal pilots and tests, and obviously cost-benefit modeling, etc. And increasingly looking at tools which can do that across organizational boundaries. This is a little example which I like to share, but I think symbolizes a lot about this agenda. And this was a Nesta project started a few months ago in South London as a response to the library service, which was facing severe cuts. And the idea was generated that citizens should be asked to put their own book collection on the library database, since most people, once you've read a book and you put it on your shelves, you never look at it again. And so if you want to borrow a book, you go on the library database and it tells you that someone in your street or the next street has it, and you go to them, knock on the door, borrow the book, and it's recorded on the library system. Incredibly simple, obvious idea. At a stroke, dramatically increases the resources available to the library service, increases public engagement, helps people get to know their neighbours, and is a very, very scalable innovation, using essentially the same concepts as couch surfing, but applied to library books. And I think almost every single public service can use tools of this kind with a bit of lateral thinking. But it required an outside body, Nesta, and a group of other kind of innovation people for it to happen. It would not have arisen through the formal linear public structures. We then have a whole set of issues around trying to sustain and embed the new models which are more effective. One of the things which we put a lot of effort into in the UK is a new entity which we've launched this year called the Alliance for Useful Evidence, which has tried to bring together all the organizations involved in assessing what works, what's cost effective, and so on, and raising the quality of both the production of evidence by academia and so on, but also the use of evidence within schools, police forces, and so on. And we're doing this jointly with the main funding council, Research Funding Council, and our aim is that within every single sector, there should be a clear and easily accessible point of reference on the cost effectiveness, the impact of different models, whether it's schooling or early years support or reducing reoffending. We have a model in the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence which does this already for clinical interventions in health, but we feel we need this right across the board as part of a working innovation system which can be rigorous about value for money. And if you're interested, I say there's a lot of materials on our website and will be a lot more in the next few weeks and months. A lot of the methods we've been working on generally on innovation are about growth and scaling. How do you grow your business, grow your idea, grow your IP, etc. Again, I won't go into that, except to say a little bit about this new ecology of funding, where I think the UK is doing some quite pioneering work, perhaps partly because of austerity, in creating and growing a whole set of new sources of finance for social enterprise, finance for social innovations, finance for ideas which really can do more for less. Last month, Big Society Capital, the thing you see in the middle there, was launched, which is a £600 million bank funded out of unclaimed bank accounts, which the banks very generously decided to give. Encouraged, of course, by a bit of legislation. They probably wouldn't have done it otherwise. But there's also a lot of experiment with other kinds of funding tool, from crowdfunding methods to social venture intermediaries and so on. All of this, though, is providing capital for these promising ideas and innovations, partly because of a sense that if they had to ask for capital within existing public structures, they'd never get it. So our hope is this much more open market for money, including a market for outcomes and things like social impact bonds, will expand the flow of innovations from ideas into impact. And the one which I've been most involved in, which I think is an example of this, is the Studio School, which was a kind of school we developed in response to continuing failure of education policy. 10 to 15% of British teenagers essentially hating school, often leaving with almost no qualifications, no engagement. And so we used innovation methods, design methods, working with teenagers and teachers and others to put together a very different idea for a school. Most of the curriculum done through real-life practical projects. We then tested it, as you should in innovation, with field trials. Those doubled academic results with everyone who went through. That persuaded the government to get behind it, and it's now being scaled very rapidly across England and in some other countries. But the point here again is it would never have happened within the existing structures. It needed an innovation agency arm's length from government to generate the ideas, test them, and then to work on the implementation. And this is, they're not all vampires. But that's the one in Yorkshire, around the corner from where my nephew is about to go to it. And we were talking a little bit earlier in the week about systemic change. What are the tools for systemic change? And I've got a sense that many of the biggest savings come from rewiring whole systems. We've seen that in fields like waste, where we've moved from landfill to recycling and energy from waste by a radical rewiring of not just the policies and the technologies and the business models and the behaviours of us as citizens. And in fields like ageing and health, which is the biggest cost driver in governments all over the world, I'm pretty certain we need equivalent systems redesign, including lots of experimentation to get the big savings and turn around those graphs I showed at the beginning, where the more you spend, the worse you get. And Nesta's involved in quite a few of these in the UK, including one or two brought from Canada, trying to test out elements of a radically rewired system which would prevent problems much more rather than just curing them, and so on. A final point. I've been a bureaucrat quite a lot of my life, which probably shows. That's why I'm wearing a suit and a tie and things like that. And I think if you don't institutionalize things, they don't really happen. And my big frustration over many years of talking about innovation is I think governments love talking about it, but are really bad at institutionalizing it. They have institutionalized it in science, though it took 50 years to do so, and there are now big budgets, big institutions, etc. in science. I think we need the equivalent on the sort of innovations I'm talking about: social, service, public innovation. And this is just one mapping of some of the sort of structures around the world doing this, some very much within government, some at arm's length, some like the I3 fund in the US, $650 million on education innovation, some like Citra in Finland. We run a thing called creative councils for municipalities, helping them innovate. The Fraunhofer Institutes in Germany are still a model in many ways of how to have very decentralized open innovation. But if you don't institutionalize, if you don't put budgets behind this, and if you don't create the right degree of arm's lengthness, don't be surprised if the innovation doesn't happen. In all of this, our biggest anxiety is really summed up by this chart. Again and again in the past, when British governments cut public spending, they had a boomerang. They cut, let's say, support for teenagers, and then 5 years later, those teenagers were in prison, costing massively more than it would have cost to help them be employable in the first time round. And so all around, we're trying to look at what are dynamic savings and what are the boomerangs happening. This is the equivalent of couch surfing for cars. It's in France. I thought being in Canada, I should have at least one francophone slide. And this is my francophone slide, which is Buzzcar, which is the collaborative consumption car rental alternative to Avis and Hertz. And in a way, my final question to all of you is, what are the equivalents to this? If you can revolutionize something like car rental, and on this system you put your own car into the system, and you decide when you want it to be rentable or not, where are we going to find the equivalent innovations which are cheaper, simpler, create value for everything which the people in this room are involved in? And there will be a bit of pain in that process, like the pain involved in dragging beautiful boats to be broken up. But in the end, that's the only way we create value for the public we're meant to serve. Thank you.
Very nicely done. Do we have volume here? Can you hear me? Okay, great. Listen, first of all, Geoff, thanks so very much. I hadn't met Geoff before, knew him by reputation, and now we know what Geoff Mulgan is all about. A terrific presentation, a tough to respond to in just a couple of minutes, but I'm going to be very brief. Geoff, thank you for bringing this to us. We share the search for what I call the alchemy of public service reform, which is about finding different ways to do better for less in an environment that is not friendly to risk in public services, is not friendly to public service leaders going off on a run on their own, even if that's to do absolutely the right thing, and we need to find, obviously, the right balance. Geoff has introduced us, first of all, to some interesting concepts, that the notion of frugal innovation. Many of us believe that innovation involves big front-end investments. Sometimes it does. That is not always the case. His first and last point, that innovation is painful, confronting the brutal facts of our organizations, that they are in many respects legacy, siloed organizations that keep on trying to tackle new and complex problems in the same old ways and continually failing. The very rich part of this presentation was just opening the door a little bit to us in the room about the extent and the richness of experimentation in the UK with doing business, the business of government and public service reform in some very different ways. We all recognize the concept of circuit economies. I'd add mental health to that one, that we're actually trying to tackle through about 15 or 16 or 17 silos, including the justice silo. We recognize these things. I know that my public service colleagues in the room will be particularly enamored of the notion of regulatory and rules-based economies. Probably one of the biggest burdens that we face in the many silos, policy silos, delivery silos, fiscal silos, accountability silos, that stand between an idea in a minister's head and delivery to a multiple needs client out there, is this notion of, there's distance between those silos, but the way that I guess Geoff helps us to think about breaking those down. So I'm going to ask Geoff in a moment to say more about the web of rules, because it's certainly right there in that siloed environment. Geoff has talked to us about the importance of prototypes, of sustainability, and evidence. And this notion that moving from end to end and floor to ceiling through the operations and programs of government to determine what services and programs are costing and what value we're getting for them is something that we've only just started in Canada, Geoff, and we need to do much more of. Financing, I will note that that in Ontario we now have, thanks to the persuasive powers of Tanya's sermon and others, the ability to create social impact bonds in the province, which is hugely important. So I want to go back to you, Geoff. I'm going to be helping field questions, but I want to go back to the web of rules and this layering on of rules and accountability requirements that occurs every time something goes wrong. I used the example yesterday, somebody buys a chocolate bar instead of expensing their breakfast at the hotel, and it's a $3 charge versus a $24 charge, and it hits the front page of the Toronto Star, and what we discover the next day is that there's an entirely new accountability regime for expenses, and on and on and on and on through policy and delivery silos. So Geoff, can I ask you this question to lead us off, because it matters a lot to the people in this room in the public service. How do we create an alternative system of accountability and risk control that will satisfy our political masters and start to move away from just applying another fresh coat of paint on top of a multi-layered, long-in-the-tooth legacy system of rule-bound government to at least start to tackle that silo, because it's a really big one, and it's actually getting thicker and more difficult rather than better as time goes by. We might be tackling, and I think we are having some success in tackling policy silos and integrating across boundaries. But this issue of rules is one that, unfortunately, is moving in the other direction. So that's my kick-off question for you. Any experience from the UK?
Well, just two comments. I did actually mention MPs' expenses. And if you're dealing with expenses within any organisation, you've got one choice is to have a whole series of rules and criteria and so on, and you can have a big manual which sets them out. Or you can say all of your expenses claims have to be public. And my guess is that when you do that, you'll get probably better behavioural effects than with the first solution. Now, that's not going to be across the board, but there are lots of problems of that kind which don't have to have a regulatory solution. There are sort of new tools to deal with them. Now, you actually said you were going to ask a different question, but it's quite nice you did ask that question, because by coincidence, I put this little chart, rather boring chart, at the end, which I didn't show, which is an incomplete one, and I'd welcome anyone's attempt to help us complete it. What we're trying to look at, the stages of innovation from the sort of understanding problems and opportunities through ideation, pilots, sustaining, and then scaling. And at each stage, what do you actually need in terms of evidence? What kinds of money do you need? And what's the risk management approach? And in some ways, this is, like all of this, a statement of the bleeding obvious. But if you're doing a very early stage, ideation, prototype, pilot, you can have a very high risk appetite. You can be expecting most things to fail because you're doing it small, you're doing it fast, the sums involved aren't very much. You also shouldn't have too demanding an evidence requirement. You should be able to experiment, be creative, and not be obsessed with immediate measurement. All of the systems of government risk management are really designed for the right-hand side of this, when you're doing things as service delivery or to scale. And it's correct, you should have a very low risk appetite when you're running the traffic lights or the school system and so on. And yet often we apply the risk management approaches from here to here, which therefore kills creativity. So I would look to any public service to have an equivalent of this chart to guide people to how they should think about risk management, evidence, and so on at each stage. And if anyone's done that, please show me, and I can plagiarize it.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Geoff. Okay, we're going to open it up, and we're actually going to look for as good a balance as we can between questions from the room and from our remote site. So who'd like to start us off with a question for Geoff? Over here.
Hi, I'm David Phipps from York University. I'm interested in the role of the private sector in social innovation. So in York Region, we've started a conversation with Venture Lab, which is our regional innovation center, providing business acceleration services to SMEs, and our primary community partner umbrella organization, the United Way of York Region. We're wondering how all three, the community sector, the academic sector, and the private sector can come together. We get creating shared value, in the words of Michael Porter, which is really, if you read that, it's very focused on multinationals. What's the role of SMEs in social innovation? If they're consumed with meeting next month's payroll, how can they really engage in the social economy?
Well, maybe 2 or 3 examples, because I don't think there's a general answer to that. And in a way, if business is moving a bit away from CSR, corporate social responsibility, to corporate social innovation, and many businesses are beginning to use that language, so they don't quite know what it means, it will be very sector-specific and firm-specific. So let me give you 3 live examples. I mentioned studio schools. Studio schools depend on there being a flow of practical problems and challenges coming from the local business community and the local NGO community, which then the teenagers can work on. And in most of the poor parts of Britain, there are no large firms. So we've had to work almost entirely with SMEs, and the chairman of the Studio Schools Trust, the umbrella organisation, was the head of the small firms umbrella body in the UK. And it's working incredibly well, because for those small firms, they're actually getting quite a lot of value out of almost every step of engagement with the local school. They're getting brain power, they're getting potential new recruits, they're finding it quite enlivening for their staff. We've got no difficulty doing the sell, whereas I think 3 or 4 years ago we thought it would be very hard, but that's because there's such a clear alignment of interests. A second example, which is a stage back, I mentioned that we're an investor in various business accelerators. And those are usually taking a cohort of 10 or 15 startups in a similar space, like sort of mobile technologies, and they're all put in the same building, like a Mars, and given small amounts of finance, intensive support, etc. What we're trying to do is evolve that in 2 directions. One is to work with large companies for them to co-sponsor the accelerators and offer contracts, but the other is to target them on social issues. So we're hoping to have one on education and one around health and aging with corporate partners, but the ventures very much focused on practical problem solving. And for us to be very neutral whether they end up being for-profit startups or social enterprise startups, so long as they can demonstrate impact, a market, etc. I think there's a lot of work to be done on really answering your question. We had an event last week with the 200 top firms in Europe, essentially asking them, what are you going to do in this social innovation space? Where are there the useful collaborations? There are some good examples like Danone yogurt and Grameen, but they're very few. And I think big business has been pretty slow to really get its head around this agenda. And my hope is they'll now catch up a little bit with the social innovation pioneers like the SIGs and so on, because it feels to me still a lot of big businesses about 5 years behind.
Thank you.
Okay. So, Geraldine, we have an off-site question.
We do. The first one from British Columbia, I'm not sure if Donna is in Vancouver or in Victoria, but she was asking a question which I know Geoff's been asked too this week. Canada survived the financial crisis somewhat better than, say, the UK or the US. She says there's a more real and perceived austerity in the UK. What level of austerity do you think is required to drive the level of support for innovation that you describe?
Well, we were talking a bit before about economies of regulation. Please don't economize on bank regulation. You know, the reason you didn't survive is that we slashed various bits of regulation on the financial sector with disastrous effects. So it's about appropriate regulation for different things. We are obviously deeply envious of your state as a country and think it's very unfair that you're doing so well, and very unfair that I get invited to speak about austerity because being a Brit, that's kind of our calling card now. You know, I don't know how many years it will take to sort of shake off this, this association. I think there is a rough link between austerity prompting innovation, but it's not automatic. I think as several of the conversations here have confirmed, often the first response to austerity is fatalism, or just retrenchment, or just cutting back. It requires a lot of courage to actually use austerity to accelerate innovation. And it requires genuine leadership, you know, the ability to see 5 years ahead, not just 1 year ahead. And it's fascinating watching in countries like the UK, and Australia is moving a bit in this direction, which leaders get it and have that element of sort of leadership and vision, and which ones don't. And it was exactly the same in previous periods of austerity. I like to use as the model Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who I think still is fairly unique in having been elected president and being very honest that in conditions of intense austerity, but in the face of a crisis, if you don't experiment, you don't innovate, that's a much greater failure. And the fact that he was re-elected, you know, 3 times shows this is not necessarily fatal for a political career or a leadership career. I just worry we don't have the right caliber of leadership to make the most either of austerity and perhaps even more of non-austerity, because perhaps you need even more leadership qualities to create the feeling of necessity to innovate even when the background conditions look okay. And that's why I showed the health charts at the beginning, because I think even those countries which don't face anything like the Greece, Portugal, Spain kind of cataclysm, all of us face these intense upward pressures on costs of an unprecedented nature. And therefore, anyone who has a sense of responsibility to the future, to your children and so on, has to be serious about this agenda.
Okay, thank you. Anybody on this side? Yes.
I enjoyed your economies of scale, penetration, etc. I'd like to suggest another one, economies of knowledge succession. Baby boomers are going to be retiring in large numbers in the next 5 to 10 years. Gen Y people don't want to stay at one job for more than a couple of years, they just move on. So organizations lose their knowledge, and that is inefficient. So would you like to comment on ways in which one can do knowledge management to achieve economies?
We were discussing that a little bit in
Bob
this.
Logan,
Yeah.
University of Toronto, Strategic Innovation Lab at OCAD.
Right. We were discussing just that a little bit in this room on Monday in relation to aging. And I gave the slightly painful anecdote of John Brown, the Chief Executive of BP, who 4 years ago I invited to give a lecture on aging and employment. And he gave what I thought was a brilliant lecture about exactly the issue you talked about. They had a shortage of engineers coming into the company. They were seeing all these very expensively educated engineers retiring, often retiring early, and this was just madness from a business point of view. And he proposed in this lecture a series of changes to the employment contract, which would keep people as really members of the company throughout their retirement, called on at different times to be mentors or coaches or expert advisors. And the next day, well, actually that very afternoon, his board hit the roof. His head of HR hit the roof, and within a few months he was out. There were other reasons why he was out, but that was one of the factors, which I won't go into, that he was out. And yet, in a way, he was saying we need institutional innovation to mobilize experience. And that's even perhaps more true of civil services, where in this country and in quite a few others, there'll be a vast outflow of cohorts of extremely experienced, knowledgeable people in the next 5 or 10 years, which is a massive waste. And again, I think the mixture of technological innovations and institutional ones to orchestrate access to knowledge, experience is as important as what I was talking about, orchestrating data. But again, these are fields which just need disciplined innovation, experiment. We don't know which models will actually work best. The only way to find out is to try quite a lot of different ones and assess which ones are most successful.
Thank you. We're going out of Toronto again, I think, Geraldine.
We're just going to go to Ottawa for a moment. And this sort of follows up on that idea, Geoff, but on your point about generating lots of ideas, the Ottawa office was saying that traditional mechanisms to generate lots of ideas have had limited success, like rewards and so on. If you were to recommend one mechanism, what would it be and how could it be institutionalized?
Well, I've got a bit of a bias on this. Although we are, we're launching these various challenge prizes, we're involved in various crowdsourcing platforms, my own experience is that often the very best ideas come from having teams of people who get really good at generating ideas. I mean, that's why labs matter, and why at their best they bring together groups of people who over many years get a deep knowledge of a field, get an intuitive feel for what kind of ideas will work, know how to adapt and adjust them. That's exactly how most science is organized, most medicine, most technological development is not scattergun. It's having concentrated teams who are good at ideas. Those teams will often work best if they're also open to plenty of other people. Will also often work best if they're open to user experience and consumer experience. But this is why I'm obsessed with this institutionalization question. We need specialized laboratories, hubs, to act as the cause for doing this sort of work well. And they need to be given the time and the money and the backing to get really good at doing that. And most of the kind of shortcuts, the kind of wisdom of crowd type shortcuts don't really work. And that's why, say, building up labs of different kinds in real places and giving them, budgets lasting 3 or 5 years, not 3 or 5 months, is crucial to improving performance in this whole territory.
Okay, thank you. Time for one more question, and it looks like it's coming from Vas.
Hi, my name is Vas Bednar. I'm with the School of Public Policy and Governance, and I wanted to ask you a question related to data and the role of data in facilitating some of the innovations we've been alluding to. You asked us to think of public sector examples of things like the couch surfing. So I've been thinking about it for at least 20 minutes, and it strikes me that there are some serious risks. Say we're closing a few community centers and the pools are gone. For citizens to come together and make a map and say, everyone, come over to my house, I've got a swimming pool back here, you can swim. So there are some things that, the state is offering or doing in a way that's more maybe efficient or effective. But with data, I see opportunities for, like when the TTC was sharing some more data and individuals were able to create some apps, or which, built community or helped people out and reflects also well on the service itself because people can access information in a timely and accessible way. So how do we also, I guess the question is more around how we also sort of facilitate and encourage wider and deeper data access for both research, but also these types of innovations?
I don't really know the answer to your question, but I think it will probably have at least 2 sides to it. So one is creating norms of data generation. So I think there's been a lot of progress, certainly in the UK and other countries in the last few years, of making it the default that public data and a lot of public administrative data should be made available to the public in easily usable forms. And that's, in a sense, a decree from on top, in our case at least, is required to make that happen. What hasn't happened yet is really applying that to private contractors on public contracts, and indeed NGO ones. And I hope we will move to making it almost a condition of getting any kind of public funding that you have to make yourself transparent, you have to provide your data. And this will be a very painful thing, particularly for a lot of big corporates, and ironically, particularly big corporates in the web world like Google and Facebook, who never share their data with anyone. They're the most secretive organizations on earth, paradoxically. Anyway, that's a battle yet to come. And then the other side of the coin is greater capacity to use that data, to mash it, mine it, turning it into services. And some of that will happen automatically. So like in London, we have a London data store, which provides lots of transport and other information, and lots of organizations have almost spontaneously developed apps for using that. But I think there's probably a role for bodies like Nesta and perhaps equivalents here in Canada, providing small grants to help creative use of data. And we ran a program over 2 years, total cost about £100,000, out of which came about 25, really good projects, which nearly all being scaled, ranging from tools for helping the case management of vulnerable teenagers, to the library one I mentioned, to ones around land ownership. And in a sense, the impact per pound of those was really, really high. And we're going to be doing a lot more in that space over the next year or two. And that also then, in a sense, increases the competence and confidence of the programmers and coders and so on to really get stuck into making the most. Because my fear is we'll have a flood of data will be made available, but we won't really reap the value from it.
Okay, I think we're done.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I think you share a view that this was a wonderfully rich conversation that went from the system right to some wonderful practical examples that I think made Geoff's big ideas real for all of us. Geoff, thank you very much. You've worked hard this week, and yet again, you've delivered today. Thank you so much, and Tony, for... And thank you, Tony, for helping us wrap this up. Thank you to all of you for participating here today, and to all of our friends across the country. We hope to continue this conversation in the months to come. Thank you.